Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I see folks are joining. Welcome to the STAR Webcast, the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. Give a moment. I see attendees coming in. If you haven't already, grab some coffee. This is going to be a great webcast today. I am Katie Nichols. I have two different jobs. My day job is as the Director of Intelligence for Red Canary, and I'm also an instructor for the SANS Institute for the Cyber Threat Intelligence class. So I will be your host today as I welcome shortly our two guest speakers, Van Ta and Aaron Stevens from Mandiant. They're going to be chatting about spooky RYUKy, RYUK, potato, massive ransomware threat that I know my team has seen, a lot of teams have seen. So you're in for a good webcast today. Let's kick off by talking about why we're here. If you've joined us before, this is a monthly webcast, and the whole goal why we're here is to bring you the inside scoop of what analysts who track these threats every day are doing, right? And we want to bring you different voices. We have folks from Mandiant who will be joining us in a moment. And the whole goal of this webcast is for you to go out, take what we've shared and action it. So you'll have some action items at the end of our broadcast, our webcast today, and a lot of action items. So you have homework from this, fair warning. The way we're going to run today for our webcast, start out with a rundown of some things going on recently. Then I'll hand it off to Aaron and Van for a deep dive into a few different UNC groups and ultimately leading to ransomware, and then we'll wrap things up and give you your homework. I will answer the major questions we have up front. Yes, this is being recorded. It will be posted to YouTube afterwards, so you can share it with your friends later. And yes, there will be a PDF of the slides, which you're probably going to need because we have a bunch of links and awesome content to share with you. Let's start off by talking about a few things that have been going on in the threat landscape lately. And I think Thomas Rid captured how I felt over the past week or two, actually the past month, with his tweet on Friday in "I can't keep up." There has been so much happening in recent weeks. I know I've been struggling to keep up with all the reporting, all the different threats. So just wanted to highlight a couple things that I've seen that are probably worth checking out in terms of threats. First one, there's a new technique out there. Yes, it is actually called process herpaderping. When I first saw the tweet, I thought it was a joke. It's not a joke. This is a new technique that some folks who work at CrowdStrike, I believe, researched and identified, kind of similar to process hollowing. And whenever a new technique like this comes out, there's often this debate of, well, this is sort of a proof of concept, this is theoretical. We've seen, and I'm sure, Aaron and Van and their team have seen this too, sometimes adversaries will pick up these new techniques very quickly. Sometimes it takes a while. But regardless, this is definitely a technique that's worth looking into. A few different researchers have been trying to figure out how can we detect it as defenders and analysts. So worth looking into there. And I have some links at the end of the slides for you to help you out with your research there. Next item I wanted to bring your attention to, if you follow MITRE ATT&CK, big release yesterday, a few key things. First off, they added two tactics to the enterprise framework. What basically happened was pre-attack, which is sort of the left of boom stuff, went away, and then added the tactics, reconnaissance and resource development to what you know as main attack or enterprise attack. Also added a bunch of network infrastructure techniques for routers, etc. And so that's definitely worth checking out when you have some time. The third bullet, and I have a whole separate slide on this. Been kind of a busy week, as everyone in the entire world probably knows. The US election, presidential election, is on Tuesday. And ahead of that, the US government has done a lot. There have been a ton of reports of election interference attempts, sanctions from Treasury, and there's been so much that I actually just put together a separate slide, in part to help me track this past week, because it feels like every day there was something new. And so your homework is going to be go read all of this. Honestly, I'm still catching up, but this all started, well, earlier this month, there were some alerts, but last week, you might recall, major indictment of GRU actors. This indictment is a good read. It brings together a lot of the reporting that folks in the community have done over years and years, but kind of gives you a little more detail of the actors behind the keyboard. So that's a good one to read. I also have some links that if you don't have time to read it, folks like Thomas Rid and John Holtquist and Dmitry Alperovich have given great summaries on Twitter of some of these key points. So GRU indictment was last Monday. Next day, NSA comes out with a list of all these vulnerabilities that have been exploited by Chinese actors. So go patch your stuff. Later in the week, we found there was some attempted election interference. You might recall hearing about those emails coming from Proud Boys, supposedly. Then that same day, I believe, there was a press conference where the US government came out in a matter of hours, attributing those emails to Iranian actors. And they also called out Russian actors for attempted election interference too. And the next day, FBI and CISA put out joint alerts on those actors. And then Department of Treasury also gets in on the action. Sanctions on Iranian actors, sanctions on Russian actors, the institute where Triton, that previous ICS malware, was supposedly developed. And then yesterday, not to be left out, there was a DHS alert on North Korean activity. So yeah, kind of a lot. In totality, my take on this is that the US government seems to be sending a significant message to major cyber actors around the world that we know about you, we see your election interference attempts, and it's going to be an interesting last couple of days before the election. But I've been really impressed with DHS in particular, with Chris Krebs, who's the director of CISA, came out and said something that I think is so important to highlight in all of this. And as analysts, I think all of us have a responsibility to make sure that we're on the same page and we're being clear about what's attempted interference, what's actual interference. And I love this quote from Chris Krebs saying that there's confident, no actor can change your vote, and basically emphasizing this fact that we still should have confidence in our system. And CISA put out this great site on rumor control. Encourage you to share that with friends and family. And of course, if you haven't voted and you're in the US, please get out and vote. But these last few days, probably going to be busy for us as cyber analysts. Did I forget anything? Those are the major things, right? Just election interference, nothing else that's been impacting tons and tons of organizations. Right. How about ransomware? Seems like every day there's a new ransomware family with some crazy name. We got Ryuk, we got REvils threatening different companies. We got Maze, tons of different actors, ransomware operators. It's gotten to a pretty bad place. And so with that, I didn't want to summarize all those stories because wanted to let Aaron and Van take it away. So really pleased to welcome Van Ta and Aaron Stevens. They're on Mandiant's advanced practices team, the FLAIR team. And these folks do an awesome job digging into what are those advanced techniques that adversaries are using. So with that, Van, Aaron, you can go ahead and share your slides. These are some of my favorite slides that I have ever seen. You can see, Halloween is Saturday, so take it away, Van, Aaron.
All righty, thank you for having us. Thanks for having us on, Katie. So good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone has their costumes ready as we present Spooky RYUKy, the return of UNC1878. Now, it's no surprise that defenders are feeling the effects of interactive ransomware intrusions as of late. And to make matters worse, interactive intrusions leading to the deployment of RYUKy ransomware has made a comeback beginning early September after disappearing for several months. So today, we'll be discussing this recent campaign and how we approached it from a technical attribution perspective, tying the recent intrusions to a group that we call UNC1878. Now, UNC1878 first made its public debut when we published a blog post in March of this year, attributing the tradecraft seen in interactive RYUKy deployments happening during that time to UNC1878. So we're going to tell the full story of UNC1878 as we know it thus far, recapping how the UNC was created, as well as covering their TTPs from both their older and most recent operations. At this point, we're still on the title slide, and I've already mentioned UNCs quite a bit. Full disclaimer, we're only getting started, but have no fear, I'll be diving into exactly what an UNC is a little bit later on. So before we get into it, let's go through some quick intros. My name is Van Ta, and today I'm joined by Aaron Stevens, aka 4Steve. We're both senior threat analysts on the FLAIR Advanced Practices team. Our team mission is simple: to know more about the adversary than anyone else, and to make that knowledge actionable to FireEye. To deliver on this mission, we do three things. First, we make key analytical decisions on what can be defined as an adversary versus a threat. We make these decisions day in and day out to know what are the groups and techniques that matter to our customers to determine where our focus should be. Second, we pursue these adversaries wherever they are within our ecosystem, whether we find them in our product telemetry, through Mandiant incident response engagements, or through managed defense. Our focus is surfacing adversarial activity. And lastly, we institutionalize what we learn through our pursuit to make it actionable for FireEye. So that can manifest in a number of different tangible things, such as product detections, hunting methodologies, code family classification, technical attribution, and the curation of our threat model. So I'll now quickly pass it over to Aaron to frame the data that we're presenting today.
Thanks, Van. So before we get into the analysis, I wanted to talk briefly about the data we have and where it comes from. On the advanced practices team, we have what I like to call data privilege, hashtag data blessed. But really all that means is that we sit in a really cool and unique place in the company where we see a lot of data from a lot of sources. Between Mandiant consulting, product telemetry, and our 24/7 managed defense, there's never a shortage of things to look at. To give you an idea of volume, we support roughly 65% of all event responses, which are nearing 1,000 for the past year, not to mention our product discovery and external detection work. If you haven't already, check out the Scandalous blog from myself and Andrew Thompson to learn more about that. Now, having all this data is really cool, but we're here to talk about ransomware and more specifically, Ryuk. So let's get into it. If you were to ask me to name ransomware families, I could probably give you 10 or so off the top of my head, but we actually track over 100 ransomware families. Many of these we've only seen once or twice, and those fall into the other category, but the rest I've broken out here. Looking at the pie chart, roughly 1 in every 5 ransomware intrusions we observe are Ryuk. As a side note, the only malware family more prevalent across all of these intrusions is, of course, Cobalt Strike. If we drill down into this data further, we can see the threat groups responsible for these intrusions. We arrive finally at UNC1878, who again accounts for about 1/5 of Ryuk intrusions. But if we focus on the last year alone, it becomes almost exclusively UNC1878. And herein lies our monster. Continuing this zombie analogy, UNC1878 aren't your average zombies like those on, say, The Walking Dead. Nah, they're more like 28 Days Later zombies. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it means they're really fast. To get a sense of just how fast, let's look at the average time to Ryuk, or what I like to call TTR. This is the time delta from when we first see UNC1878 to when we first see Ryuk in the environment. Across all the intrusions where we saw UNC1878 deploy Ryuk, average TTR was, anyone want to guess? Just 5 days, 17 hours. And if that wasn't spooky enough, their current high score is only 2 days, 6 hours. It's worth noting here that other public reporting has claimed even faster TTRs down to just a few hours. To put these numbers in perspective, the average dwell time for all ransomware intrusions that we observed in 2019 was a whopping 72.5 days. Now, dwell time is defined as the amount of time an adversary is in the environment before an investigation begins. While this metric is fundamentally different than TTR, UNC1878 could ransom 13 environments in the same amount of time based on their average TTR. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. UNC1878 is in the title of the presentation, and we've already mentioned UNCs a few times today. But we know some of you might be wondering, what is an UNC, or why isn't this a fin group? Those are all great questions, and I'm going to hand it back off to Van to explain.
So before we go further into UNC1878's story, we felt it would be helpful to go over some required reading on UNCs. What is it? What is it used for? And what do we do with it as a team and as a company? So while we've discussed the term UNCs publicly before, it's oftentimes overshadowed by its older siblings, the FIN and the APT. So we'll also touch on the difference there. So going back to our mission and the core pillars of our team, no matter where we find malicious activity, we often find a lot of it, even at a single client organization. In order for us to effectively conduct investigations and incident response at scale, we need to organize the malicious activity in such a way that would define what it is we care about. To do so, we use UNCs, short for uncategorized, as a way to cluster unique activity and to say that we believe this cluster is all fundamentally related to the same intrusion set. And by making this key assessment, we can then begin analyzing what would otherwise be disparate intrusions at our clients. So at a fundamental level, UNCs serve as labels for which you can bucket indicators and techniques into. This labeled bucket would then act as a technical anchor for what we are saying is related activity. We could then take that bucket and use it as the foundation for our analysis and hunting. So to use a real world analogy, let's think of a single incident at a client being a real life crime scene where something particularly sinister has happened. So there's an abundance of crimes that happen in a day. And so to investigate this particular crime of interest, we need to label the evidence that we can prove is related to the crime committed. What do? Well, our team would create an UNC. So at this particular crime scene, this UNC may be no more than a small cluster consisting of a foot impression and perhaps a partial fingerprint. But by saying they're related, we could then apply this cluster against a larger corpus of crimes. And as we respond to more activity and gather more evidence, we may progress from these fingerprints to a murder weapon, then to a profile, and eventually establish tradecraft. So UNCs in the world of computer crimes are really no different. So instead of foot impressions and fingerprints, we're dealing with IPs and hashes. Instead of labeling an evidence bag the Overlook Hotel, we're labeling it UNC1878. So over time, these UNCs that we create can grow, revealing ties to other clusters, which could then lead to a merge of UNCs. And eventually, as we begin to have a strong grasp of an UNC's operation, UNCs can also potentially graduate into APTs and FINs. So really, APT and FIN groups are the big time criminals that long ago started as an UNC. So FIN 11 that we just graduated used to be UNC 902. APT 41, more like UNC 78 before they made their big break. And APT 42, possibly you, young buck. So APTs and FINs are groups which we've observed committing crimes against dozens of victims over the years. And this requires long-term surveillance of these actors. So at any given time, Mandiant tracks over 1,500 UNCs. And we have some fantastic research published by a colleague of ours, Matt Berninger, AKA Bernie, for those interested in learning more about how we cluster activity at scale. The blog is titled Going Atomic, and it's on our FireEye blog website. So because every horror film universe loves a good origin story, let's dive into UNC1878, starting with its genesis. So in March of this year, Aaron and I published a blog where we discussed UNC1878, focusing a little bit less on their TTPs and more so on our cycle of identification, expansion, and discovery to track UNC1878 across our data set. So to quickly recap the blog, this all started in our managed defense organization, our managed detection and response service, where we initially observed Cobalt Strike beacon activity and attempted lateral movement approximately 46 minutes after a trick bot infection, which was highly unusual. In addition, the beacon C2 seen on screen here was a pretty clever masquerade. The domain was registered just 2 days before being identified at this client, and the Cobalt Strike self-signed certificate validity date was less than 24 hours prior. So these pieces all together certainly warranted our attention. So on this day, January 29th, 2020, UNC1878 was born. So using evidence at this client, we built a profile on UNC1878's infrastructure based on the criteria seen on screen. From the single C2 identified at the managed defense client, we used third-party scan data to quickly expand to 12 additional servers that exhibited characteristics used by UNC1878. Now, at this point in time, we couldn't assess UNC1878's goals or objectives due to quick response and containment by our managed defense team, but the UNC served as a technical anchor for us to begin expanding and searching against our data. So within days, we began seeing these indicators we had attributed to UNC1878 at multiple managed defense clients and organizations engaged in Mandiant IR, where we then saw UNC1878 complete mission by deploying Ryuk ransomware and demanding payment in Bitcoin. Within 2 months of the creation of the UNC group, Mandiant responded to well over a dozen intrusions we attributed to UNC1878, each with varying degrees of success in their deployment of ransomware. So during this 2-month time period that I mentioned, or what I like to call UNC1878's formative years, we observed and learned a lot about their operation. So let's take a look at some of their TTPs, some of which we'll be revisiting later on in the presentation. So for initial access, UNC1878 was leveraging TrickBot phishing campaigns. Now I want to quickly note that not all TrickBot equates to UNC1878, and the same is true for Ryuk. Not all Ryuk equals UNC1878. With regards to TrickBot, given the complexities of the underground malware ecosystem, our team bases our attribution on the specific tradecraft that represents UNC1878, which encompasses the follow-on activity after TrickBot, ultimately leading to ransomware deployment. So after initial access is provided by TrickBot, UNC1878 further establishes a foothold using offensive security tooling to begin interaction. And that's when the shot clock really starts. So with regards to offensive security tooling, UNC1878 heavily uses Cobalt Strike. UNC1878 used Cobalt Strike at every single intrusion we responded to during this 2-month time period. Now, the majority of UNC1878 beacon payloads were configured with the Amazon Malleable C2 profile, which is publicly available on GitHub. UNC1878 often used both staged and stageless beacon payloads at the same client. So PowerShell one-liners, reflective loaders, SMB beacons, they used it all, which certainly puts emphasis on having strong detections for the framework. Lastly, we observed UNC1878 code sign their Cobalt Strike payloads as well. So signed malware and specifically Cobalt Strike is nothing new, but it's an important data point to consider when determining a group's capabilities. So UNC1878 would also use the same code signing certificate to sign 2 different malware families. So for example, on screen here, we can see a code signing certificate that was used to sign both Beacon and Ryuk. Besides Cobalt Strike, UNC1878 also used payloads generated from PowerShell Empire and Metasploit, though not as frequently. UNC1878 targeted credentials using a combination of publicly available tools, including Mimikatz, Lasagna, Kerbrute, and Kerberoast. So with legitimate credentials, UNC1878 extended their access by connecting to network shares and directly to systems over RDP and SSH. They also use lateral movement techniques built into Cobalt Strike, like using PSExec to execute an SMB beacon. Now at this point in the intrusion, we also saw UNC1878 using System BC, specifically version 2. So System BC is a proxying utility that creates SOC 5 proxies between a C2 and remote hosts. Specifically, version 2 added functionality for file download and execution as well. Now, there's a lot of great publicly available research out there on this malware family that we highly recommend reading. So throughout this whole motion, UNC1878 is performing extensive Active Directory reconnaissance using publicly available tools like Bloodhound, ADFind, and PowerSploit. After UNC1878 has landed on a domain controller, we see them extracting the ntds.dit file using volume shadow copy and save it on disk in either the users or perflogs directory, along with the system and security registry hives. They'll then archive all three with a very inconspicuous name like 1.zip or 1234.zip to exfiltrate. So we know that UNC1878's end goal is to deploy Ryuk, but what did that really look like? So once on a domain controller, UNC1878 will then drop a zip file into the perflogs directory. They'll then unzip into a directory they create named share $. And 6 key components are then extracted here. So the first component consists of text files named comps.txt that are numbered and can contain several thousand computer host names from the target environment. Along with these text files are psexec, the ransomware binary, and 3 batch files used to propagate the malware, which can be seen on screen here. So both wmy.bat and copy.bat are used to transfer the Ryuk binary onto target systems, and exe.bat is used to execute them. So all 3 batch scripts take the comps.txt files in as inputs and iterates through the list of computer names to copy and execute Ryuk. So focusing more specifically on the Ryuk binary, we saw UNC1878 signing these as well. And similar to the beacon example that we talked about before, UNC1878 would use the same code signing certificate between multiple malware families. So the example certificate that we see on screen here was used to sign both Ryuk and System BC v2. So again, we're seeing another example of this tradecraft employed. So Ryuk samples they deployed also used a custom loading sequence that's seen on screen here, which consists of the outer PE file, a shellcode loader that we track as Dave shell, and a DLL loader that loads the final payload. So we've seen the specific overall sequence used by UNC1878 to load both Ryuk and System BC v2. Dave shell, which is the shellcode loader portion in the sequence on screen here, is based on a GitHub project. And we've seen Dave shell being leveraged across a variety of malware families, not just ones used by UNC1878. And one last important point regarding their mission completion is that we haven't seen UNC1878 steal data to extort their victims or to do any sort of naming and shaming like we've seen some of the other groups do. So as I mentioned before, over a 2-month time frame, we responded to well over a dozen incidents attributed to UNC1878. And as I've presented in the last couple slides, we established a pretty strong MO on the UNC group. So I'll now pass it over to Aaron to talk about what happened next.
So by the end of 2019 and early 2020, Ryuk and UNC1878 were prolific. Here, I've graphed all the Ryuk intrusions we've observed for 2020 thus far. We continued to see activity in February and March, but then in April, nothing. In May, nope. June, 0. July was more of the same, and by August, we almost thought this might be the end of Ryuk. As so many malware families and threat groups have done in the past, maybe Ryuk's time had come and gone. Obviously, we were really wrong. Beginning in September, we began to see Ryuk make its harrowing return. It wasn't dead, it was undead, and we're already seeing them this month as well. So what happened over the summer? Did they drive off into the sunset with their fast cars and millions of dollars? Did the pandemic have something to do with it? Or were they simply deciding to make a much needed vacation? We're not really sure. All we know is what the data tells us. And the data tells us that Ryuk has returned. But does that mean that UNC1878 has returned? Well, not so fast. On advanced practices, we never attribute based on malware family alone. We need more evidence of overlap. It's been 5 months since we've seen Ryuk or UNC1878, and things aren't exactly the same as they were before. I'm overgeneralizing here, but the classic UNC1878 brand from earlier this year was TrickBot, Cobalt Strike, and Ryuk. We already have Ryuk, so we're good there. TrickBot, on the other hand, is a different story. This new wave of Ryuk intrusions have essentially replaced TrickBot with KegTap, a similar but distinctly different malware family. We don't have much to say about KegTap right now, but keep an eye out for future blogs and presentations. And then Cobalt Strike. Are we still seeing it being used in Ryuk intrusions? Of course, but also not quite. Because Cobalt Strike is so widely used by threat actors, we have to be really picky when it comes to attribution. The Cobalt Strike we see today isn't quite the same as it was a few months ago. Let me explain. Here are some examples of recent Cobalt Strike C2 URLs that we've seen. There are a couple things here that I want to point out that are different from what we used to see. First, there are these subdomains, usually 2 to 4 characters and typically 2 or 3 of them per domain. This is a pattern that didn't exist before. All of our UNC1878 domains in the past were only a single level. The other key difference is the URIs. Where we used to see one of the prepackaged malleable C2 profiles, such as the Amazon one mentioned earlier by Van, these URIs appear to be custom and more random. The other big difference we've observed between the old Cobalt Strike activity and the new is the TLS certificates. If you read Van and I's blog, you may recall that UNC1878 primarily used Let's Encrypt for their certificates, and that's not what we have here. As you can see, these certs don't have a certificate authority. They're all self-issued. We've still noticed some patterns though. Most of the certs have this Texas metadata. Note in some cases, like the second one, Texas is misspelled. Mountain View, California is another one. LOL is also the listed organization for most of these certs, but we've also seen them use Office and occasionally incorporate all or part of the domain as well. So at this point, we're not feeling confident that this new wave of Ryuk activity is UNC1878, though we have our suspicions. It's been a long time since we've seen this group active. TrickBot is gone, and the Cobalt Strike is notably different. So what do we do now? Well, in the spirit of Dr. Seuss, we do what we always do when something is new. We UNC it. Just because we can't attribute this new activity directly to UNC1878, we're not going to let that slow us down or prevent us from doing our work. We still need a label to track this new activity, so we create a new UNC, UNC2352. This allows us to continue our analysis without forcing us into a potential state of misattribution. We know all the new Ryuk intrusions look the same. We're just not ready to say it's the same as before, and that's okay. Our unique position on advanced practices gives us the visibility to self-correct over time. Ryuk is showing no signs of letting up, but every observation we get is an opportunity to learn. If these two groups should really be the same, the data will tell us. And in this case, it did. So let's examine some of the overlaps we identified that helped us make the case for UNC1878 attribution. Back in January, UNC1878 copied the ntds.dit file into the perflogs directory along with the security and system registry hives. Quoting from ultimatewindowsecurity.com, the ntds.dit file is a database that stores Active Directory data, including information about user objects, groups, and group membership. It includes the password hashes for all users in the domain, unquote. Once these hashes are obtained, a threat actor can use tools like Mimikatz for pass the hash or attempt to crack them offline. They then created a multi-part RAR archive in preparation for exfil. Now in October, we saw almost the same thing at an UNC2352 intrusion. This all really came together when we found this batch script at another client, which shows how they use ntdsutil to make this happen. Focusing back on Cobalt Strike Beacon, we were still able to identify some similarities despite the previously mentioned differences. First, file names. Both UNCs like to use the P32 or 64 name for beacon payloads. We saw this naming convention used for hosting as well as on disk. And if you haven't already noticed, they both really like that perflogs directory too. The other thing we noticed was the continued use of code signing certificates across multiple malware families, where UNC1878 was signing beacon and Ryuk samples, UNC2352 was signing beacon and KegTap. Now, we never saw an UNC1878 certificate used to sign an UNC2352 sample or vice versa, but the TTP remains, and it's another point for a potential merge. Last but not least, we have here a couple commands for deploying Ryuk. As you can see, they're almost identical. Much like Van mentioned earlier, they use WMI along with the share folder and bitsadmin to transfer Ryuk to all of the hosts listed in those comps.txt files. In this case, not only is the TTP the same across both groups, but we can even see similarities in the naming convention and file paths used as well. This is a really strong overlap between UNC1878 and UNC2352, giving us the confidence we needed to begin a merge. Finally, we have the evidence to support our initial suspicion that UNC2352 is in fact UNC1878. It may seem like a lot of work for a conclusion that we expected all along, but our team prides itself on attribution backed by data, and sometimes that takes time. Beyond what I already covered, additional overlaps include the use of domain registrars like Namecheap and OpenProvider, and returning to the same victim on multiple occasions. From conception in January to mysterious disappearance in the summer and a return from the grave with the now merged UNC2352, it's been an interesting year for UNC1878. That's our story so far. You're all caught up now. It's time to wrap things up, and for that, I'll hand it back to Van.
So we've now gone over UNC1878's older set of intrusions from earlier this year and their newer campaigns. The best way to summarize UNC1878 as we know it today would be based on two key themes: speed and scale, which will illustrate the symmetric scene on the screen here. So 5 days, 17 hours. This is the average TTR, or time to Ryuk, representing the time we observed UNC1878 in a client environment to the time that they drop ransomware, with 2 days, 6 hours being the quickest TTR we've observed. So UNC1878 isn't running a marathon here. They're putting up NFL Combine 40-yard dash numbers. 27 hours is almost the same time it took for James Franco to cut off his own arm, but it's also the shortest delta between domain registration for their C2 to the moment we observe it at a client, which of course means there is a very real possibility this is a much lower number that we just don't have the visibility into. So let's talk about the scale of their operation. Of all the C2 proactively discovered by our team, we've only identified 20% of them used at the client. That means there's another 80% of C2 infrastructure that they have at their disposal, which we haven't seen in our data. In 2020, 83% of Ryuk intrusions were attributed to UNC1878. Now that 83% only makes up 27% of the total intrusions conducted by UNC1878 that we've observed, where UNC1878 was unsuccessful in their ransomware deployment. So this again really speaks to the scale of their operation. They're hustling. And lastly, UNC1878's ransom demands have ranged anywhere between $10 to $30 million, which probably really makes you wish you didn't stop mining that thing called Bitcoin that your weird neighbor told you about in high school. Now, our director, Steve Stone, has taught us all to speak in threes. So today, there are 3 important takeaways that we want to impart on you all. Now, it's very difficult to assess why and whether UNC1878 will go on another hiatus, As our team is extremely data-driven, we're not ready to make this assessment on whether they'll take another summer break. But what we can prove is that when they're on and operating, they are pedal to the metal. The speed and scale of their interactive ransomware deployment is alarming. The speed at which they stand up C2 and the consistency of their TTPs indicates a well-oiled operation. So this brings me to the next key takeaway. Consistency is impacted by success. While there have been natural evolutions to their operation, their overall tradecraft remains largely the same. So this consistency exists because it simply works. So as long as they're making money and as long as there are no serious costs incurred against their operation, they'll continue doing this for the foreseeable future. And if UNC1878 wasn't successful before their hiatus earlier this year, when they return in the fall, they'd probably be a completely different UNC group that might never get merged into UNC1878. But hey, we'd be ready to pursue. And lastly, simply put, attribution matters. The cycle of identification, expansion, and discovery to understand a threat group has allowed us to prioritize and tailor our responses across our services organizations. The way you'd respond to a group like APT28 is nothing like how you would handle an UNC1878 incident. We've had scenarios where we've had customers pull the plug on the internet to ensure we could evict UNC1878 prior to ransacking a network. Now that we're nearing the end, I have a little pop quiz for all you cool cats and kittens. What is an incident responder's least favorite day of the week? If you answered Monday, you're wrong. It's Friday, because that's when all the critical mass ransomware gigs start rolling in. So to make everyone's Friday a little bit brighter, this Friday, October 30th, we'll be releasing the slide deck accompanied by a list of IOCs, which you can email to kids to observe socially distant trick-or-treating. So at any time, if you see these indicators or you just want to talk, or maybe you need a little bit of help, you know who to call. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks, Katie, for having us on. Passing it back to you now.
So awesome. Thank you so much. First of all, getting a lot of feedback, so many comments. We re-enabled the chat, so everyone be responsible with chat. I will cut it off if people are rude, but so much great feedback. I was taking notes. I was trying to live tweet this, so I'm so glad more info will be coming out on Friday for this. So let's get to as many questions as we possibly can. Folks, if you can use the question and answer panel, that will help me attempt to get to as many as we can. But I want to kind of use my host privilege and dive into attribution a little bit. This is such a fun topic, and I've had great back and forth with folks on Twitter. I know you all have, Andrew and a bunch of folks from your team. So I wanted to just pick your brains a little bit on attribution. When you say attribution, how do you think about that word attribution? And I ask because, many people might think that attribution is to a country or a specific, adversary behind the keyboard, but it sounds like you're thinking of attribution even to UNCs as attribution. Could you dive into that a little bit for me?
Sure, Katie, I can take this question. Yeah, that's a great question. And we certainly think about attribution as a spectrum, with our team focusing on technical attribution. While UNCs oftentimes are synonymous with groups, we oftentimes try to think about it, from the technical TTPs that we can cluster together and can prove with data as being related. And the reason we do that is because oftentimes when you think about operators behind a keyboard, it can get a little bit hairy. Is UNC1878 that is at client A on Monday the same operators as what was there at client B on, let's say, Thursday? Well, it's difficult to say, but we use data and technical indicators to perform that level of attribution.
Absolutely. And I'll say that's the sort of attribution my team does as well, very tactically focused, right? We're seeing an overlap between XXX and VVV. They look similar. And I really like the UNC designation. And I would encourage anyone who's doing this kind of work to think about that. And maybe, initially you just notice overlaps or similarities. And then eventually, as you said, it takes time to figure out who's behind the keyboard and graduate them to FINs and APTs. So I think Andrew described it from your team as the need for different levels of granularity and confidence for attribution differs. But I think, as you said, attribution really matters, right? Is this UNC1878? Is this UNC2352? Is this someone else? Because that can matter how you respond, right? So thank you for clarifying that. On the clustering point, we had a question come in asking about the temp clusters. How do temp clusters fit into what you talked about with UNCs and then graduating to FINs and APTs?
Ooh, good question. I can take that one. So temps are a tool used by Mandiant threat intelligence to discuss clusters of activity in finished intel. So temps have UNC associations to maybe like a single UNC or even multiple UNCs, but it's not a requirement. We use UNCs on our team for event response, as the purpose is active events. But temps are used for FinTel. So they like a temp best describes that activity like in that way for finished intelligence. And oftentimes you'll see those overlaps between temps and UNCs, but they serve fundamentally a different purpose, and that's really the distinction.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So we're getting a lot of clustering questions, which is exciting. Some folks, saying this is a great way to do it. We have a question from Carlos asking, what characteristics do you use to UNC something, to cluster it beyond IPs or hashes? Are you using some of the commands you use, like WMI? So talk a little bit about what do you cluster on? And I'll actually also point back to the blog post you mentioned. I'll paste that in. But can you say, how do you cluster UNCs?
Sure. Yeah, so clustering and things that go into a cluster extend way beyond, way beyond just IPs and hashes. Like was asked in the question, it can be commands that are run. It could be credentials passed in, let's say, P-link tunneling as an example. It can be specific tradecraft on how they stand up their infrastructure, very much like what we discussed within our UNC1878 blog. So because we focus on the granularity of data, and we have systems that are able to support the granularity of data, UNCs are much more than just atomic indicators like IPs and hashes.
Excellent. All right, we got lots of questions, so I promise audience we'll get to as many of them as we can. Got a question in on Cobalt Strike. I think Caitlin chimed in, but is there a method you can identify which malleable profile a Cobalt Strike server is using?
Yeah, sure. I can take that one. So the way that we do it on our team is we look at things like the URI, and then if you have telemetry to look at more of the HTTP metadata, you'll find stuff in there. So at least for the default malleable C2 profiles, those are all on GitHub. I think if you just type Cobalt Strike malleable C2 profile into Google, you should be able to find it. You can see all of the different like URI patterns that will be used. You can see if there's any specific HTTP headers that get put in, any URI parameters, and then you can use those to basically create signatures to detect those different profiles.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful. And you provided a bunch of great recommendations for detecting Cobalt Strike, which I think is a necessity if you're trying to detect this precursor activity to Ryuk or other ransomware. So malleable C2 profiles is a great way. The certificates you talked about, that's a great way. So yeah, I would say for pretty much everyone, you need to be able to detect Cobalt Strike somehow, right? So good takeaway, and the slides will be posted so folks can dive into that a little bit later. And I dropped the link to the malleable C2 profiles on GitHub as well. All right, let's see what else we got. This is an interesting question. Have you seen these actors disable any endpoint security tools? If you can comment on that. If not, you can pass.
Van, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we have seen them disable security tooling, but yeah, we don't want to comment on that any further.
Yep, totally fair. That stuff's often sensitive. I mean, generally, I'll say I've also seen various ransomware operators killing endpoint security tools. So that's actually another great thing you can detect. The disabling of those tools can be another thing. So we have some various questions in, how do you detect this? So throughout this presentation, there are tons of tips here. Also had some questions come in on KegTap. Can you confirm? I think that's Baza. I think Andrew confirmed in chat. KegTap is what others have referred to as Baza or Bazaar loader. That's the loader component. Do I have that right?
Yep, that is correct. So what we call KegTap is what is publicly reported on Twitter and various different articles as Bazaar loader. We do have some really exciting content coming out about KegTap. Awesome. So yeah, keep tuned for that.
Awesome, cool. So there's a question on detecting that. So I'm gonna punt that to watch your Twitter feeds, I guess, but you're up there on the slide. More content coming out on KegTap. And if you're concerned about that, if anyone just looks on Twitter for hashtag BazaLoader or hashtag BazaarLoader or hashtag BazaarBackdoor or hashtag KegTap. A lot of hashtags use TweetDeck, but there's a lot of folks in the community who are tracking this right now. Because I can say that like the Mandiant team is not the only team who's seeing this activity. My team has seen this. A lot of folks are. So I think it takes a community to try to detect these actors. All right, let's see. We've got a few minutes left. So another question from the same person on the Ryuk binary and how that's changed. Sounds like we have maybe a reverse engineer asking this question. They noticed there was a difference between the UNC1878 samples and UNC2352 samples. Anything you can say on how the Ryuk binary itself has changed or not?
Sure, I can take this one. Between the early months of UNC1878 stuff, the Ryuk there that's being used in UNC2352, one of the things that we did notice that was different was the stages of loading the final Ryuk payload are slightly different. Now, the Dave shell portion, which is the portion, if you recall, is the shellcode loader stage, was used in both. We have observed that being used in both timeframes of operation. So, for example, the earlier parts of this year up to March, as well as what's being used currently. So that's a pretty big thing that we've noticed that's different between the Ryuk binaries as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Interesting question. So we've seen a trend in a lot of ransomware operators where they will basically threaten leaking data. What have you seen from these UNCs or operators of Ryuk about data leaks? Do they do that or not?
Sure. Yeah. So with UNC1878, we have not observed them steal data, for the purpose of extortion. The only thing that we see them take, again, are things like credentials. So those Active Directory copies, things like that. But in comparison to like Fin11 or any of the Maze actors who like do that name and shaming, where they're stealing data to kind of use as a leverage for a ransom payment, that's not something that we've observed with any of the UNC1878 stuff thus far.
Do you have any hypotheses on why not? And of course, just hypotheses, I won't hold you to it. I'm just curious, because we've seen a lot of other ransomware operators shift to that.
One of the things that has really been a theme since the beginning of UNC1878 is that they're very, very fast. They are, it almost feels to me like they really just stick to their playbook. They have a very singular mission, and they just want to get there as quick as possible and move on. So when you can target 100 organizations like very, very quickly, say that you only complete your mission for 20, what I mean by that is you only drop ransomware at 20 or so, and say only 2 pay out. When you're demanding 10, 20, $30 million, like that's okay. And I think that they have really just gone for a sort of quantity approach, and being able to do those as quick as possible, as many as possible, seems to be how they operate.
That makes total sense. And Andrew chiming in, and I think it's a great point that might be a reason why knowing which ransomware operator it is could impact how you respond, right? Because if you think it's one of these unks and they don't leak data, you might have a different response, talking to lawyers, a different plan, a different likelihood of paying the ransom than if they were to threaten to leak your data. So a good example of, when maybe attribution to the TTP level, to the UNC level, eventually to the person behind the keyboard might actually matter. So good point to end on. So there are a whole bunch more questions. We're not going to unfortunately have time to get to all of them, but luckily Van and Aaron have their email addresses, their Twitter accounts up there. So is it cool if people tweet you or email you with other questions?
Of course, that's what it's there for.
Awesome. You might regret that, but no, thank you both so much. Yeah, keep the conversation moving on Twitter, via email. This has been amazing content. Van, Aaron, thank you so much. So as we start to wrap up, you got homework. As I mentioned, we will post these slides in PDF. We will also post a recording of this because you have some homework to go back and think about how you could detect all this UNC behavior. Right, there's so many TTPs in here. The Cobalt Strike TTPs, keg tap slides or details are upcoming. The ransomware behavior itself, volume shadow copy deletion. So yes, you will have those slides. They'll be available on the same page you registered from. So action items, go figure out how you can detect this stuff and think about how quickly you can respond, right? There's the time to RYUK. What's your time to response? Really important to try to move towards tracking that. Even if you don't have it at scale, track a few incidents. If you think it's, keg tap or bazaar, think about how quickly you responded to it. And last but certainly not least, you have a lot of reading from this month. Go back, definitely recommend reading the blog posts that we shared in chat, all of those indictments and sanctions, because this stuff matters. And hopefully we can all take a nap and get some rest in November and December. But for now, no rest for the weary. One final quick announcement. A lot of you clearly care about threat intelligence. So the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit, I'm one of the co-chairs. It's going to be in January, all virtual, really excited. The call for presentations is open through Friday. So if anyone has awesome ideas for presentations, we're specifically looking, especially for case studies, but anything threat intelligence related, please submit a presentation. We'd love to hear your ideas. If you have questions about that, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at LikeTheCoins. And a bunch of references as promised. We'll post these slides on the SANS webpage so you can read all about these things and have reading lists for many weeks to come. And with that, thank you all so much for coming. Van, Aaron, thank you so much for sharing such valuable info and amazing graphics. And I hope you have a very happy Halloween. Stay safe, go out and vote, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you all.